Okay, many thanks to the University of Auckland and Massey University, the Society for the French Historical Studies, and the George Rudé Society for organizing this virtual conference. Thank you as well to my fellow panelists and to those of you watching the recording or participating in the discussion. Today I'll be drawing on research from my forthcoming book, pictured here, Taming Cannabis, which is out in September on McGill-Queen's University Press, and I will briefly detail the rise and fall of hashish as medicine in 19th century France. With any time remaining, or with little time remaining, I'll conclude with some lessons from this history for France as it moves closer and closer to legalizing and medicalizing cannabis today. On 11 July 2019, the French Food and Drug Administration, the ANSM, gave the green light for limited medical cannabis trials inside the hexagon, something that's been prohibited in France since 1953. Many have applauded the move as an important first step towards rational, public health-oriented cannabis regulation in France. The ANSM similarly praised the trial for its efforts to produce, quote, the first French data on the efficiency and safety of medical cannabis, end quote. This is all well and good, of course. However, a peculiar historical amnesia seems to be gripping French medicine in regard to cannabis. Put simply, these new trials are not the nation's first efforts to produce scientific data on medical cannabis. They are far from it. Over a century before the Fourth Republic banned medicinal cannabis in 1953, French pharmacists and physicians led the world in the research, development, and use of cannabis-based pharmaceuticals, sparking the first modern movement to medicalize cannabis in the West. And their successes and ultimate failures should be taken into account as France once again moves to medicalize cannabis. The story of hashish, an intoxicant made from the pressed resin of cannabis plants and pictured here, and its use as medicine in France is one that starts just after the French Revolution and revolves around the nation's efforts to expand its colonial empire in North Africa. The use of cannabis as medicine was known in France for centuries before, of course, and used in sporadic cases. But today I'm mostly talking about hashish, a preparation indigenous to the Arabo-Muslim world and not introduced to France until their imperial ventures in the Maghreb starting in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. For centuries before the arrival of the French, hashish was used throughout the Maghreb and Middle East as a recreational drug, a spiritual stimulant, and an analgesic used to treat various ailments ranging from the severe to the mundane. This, in places widespread use, was also accompanied by cycles of often severe prohibition, particularly in the Ottoman Empire during the early modern period. French doctors working mostly in Egypt during the turn of the 19th century, first with the military forces of Napoleon and later as foreign medical emissaries working with Muhammad Ali Pasha, they observed local doctors using the drug and adopted hashish into their own medical toolkits, primarily in the form of dalames, which is an edible, a confection made with hashish, or bang, which is a drink made from steeping activated hashish or cannabis in a drink, usually served hot. These French physicians used dalames and bang much as North Africans did to treat a range of illnesses affecting their patients in Egypt, including the plague and cholera, and minor issues as well, such as dysentery and insomnia. They then spread word of the medicine's successes, as well as exported the medicine itself to colleagues back in France. And numerous physicians and pharmacists published articles in French medical journals about their use of hashish to treat patients in North Africa, mostly in the early 1800s, thus spreading the word of medicinal hashish widely across France and the West by the middle of the century. Here is a quotation from the very first edition of the Bulletin de Pharmacie, the journal of the Society of Pharmacy in Paris, published in 1809, that was, as far as I found, the first call to medicalize hashish in metropolitan France. The intoxication produced by hashish, it argues, throws the user into a sort of ecstasy, similar to that achieved by Orientals through the use of opium. It even happens that users, fallen prey to its effects, engage in brutal actions that arise from dementia and delirium. But cannabis deserves the attention of pharmacists and chemists. Could they not, through analysis and diverse tests, discover some essence that we can extract and some preparations that it can furnish? As the quotation demonstrates, French pharmacists and physicians pulled from an orientalized rhetoric connecting hashish intoxication to the savagery and irrationality of non-European peoples, and in this case, Muslims in North Africa. And they did this when constructing the first pharmacological profile of hashish in Western medicine. This link between hashish and violent Muslims was first authorized in France and the West by the famous linguist or Orientalist Sylvestre de Sacy. In a speech at the Institut de France in 1809, Sacy argued, quite incorrectly it turns out, that the famous sect of Muslim assassins from the age of the Crusades, I'm talking of course about the assassins of Alamut, made famous in Marco Polo's travelogue, and also the basis of several popular cultural references today, such as Assassin's Creed video games, and also a very poor movie, Assassin's Creed. Sorry if you like the movie. But Sacy argued that these assassins were actually called in contemporary literature El Hashishaya, or hashish eaters in Arabic, by contemporaries because they supposedly used hashish to break down their disciples and transform them into blindly loyal assassins. And Sacy argued that the word assassin thus etymologically flowed from this, what he believed was a very real connection between the drug hashish and the actions and immorality, ultimately, of these assassins. As Sacy was the West's leading Orientalist and linguist at the time, his argument was largely taken as a fact by almost all scholars of the day and within multiple fields of study. The idea that hashish excited the central nervous system to such a degree that it caused one to become temporarily insane, exploitable, and prone to violence was readily adopted by French pharmacists and physicians, many of whom explained the psychoactive properties of cannabis using this rhetoric about the mythologized Muslim assassins of Alamut. The aforementioned quotation from the Bulletin de Pharmacie was in fact a review of Sacy's memoir given at the Institut de France, and you can see the citation here from the Bulletin de Pharmacie. So there's this connection almost immediately between what Sacy is arguing in the field of philology and what is ultimately adopted and ran with in the field of pharmacy and medicine. So numerous pharmacists and physicians starting in the 1830s explicitly cited Sacy's work, and especially this memoir, but also another work called Christomathia Arab, which was a grammar text that also had sort of propaganda against Muslims as well as hashish in it. It's published a bit earlier. But many in the medical field were using this to guide their opinions. In the end, there were errors in almost every premise these doctors marshaled to reach the conclusion to use hashish medically. And this ultimately led to the demedicalization of hashish tincture by about the 1870s. But for a time, and especially during the late 1840s and 1850s, tincture of hashish distilled or dissolved in alcohol, was heralded in France and beyond as a wonder drug. So here's what this looked like in terms of medical logic. Louis Remy Aubert-Roche, a French physician and epidemiologist who worked for decades in Alexandria in the early 1800s, used Dolomes to treat patients with the plague. At this time, the true origin and nature of the bubonic plague was unknown in this pre-germ theory era, and thus formed the center of arguably the most important medical debates of the era. For Aubert-Roche, and for many practicing physicians in the 1840s, the plague was a disease of the ganglionic nervous system caused by bad air, what was known as miasma. And they believed that this miasma was released from toxic and unhygienic environments, and especially in the ground. An antecedent of the medieval filth theory, this idea was known as anti-contagionism. And those who championed it, such as Aubert-Roche, used it to determine their course of medical treatment when dealing with epidemic diseases such as the plague. The plague, Aubert-Roche wrote, is primarily a disease of the nerves that originates in the thoracic and cervical ganglia. Hashish, a substance that acts upon the nervous system, has given me the best results, end quote. In his work entitled On Plague, published in 1840 and pictured here, Aubert-Roche detailed and defended his use of hashish to treat plague victims during the epidemic of 1834 and 1835 in Egypt. His primary medical reasoning for prescribing hashish against the plague was steeped in the orientalized myths about the drug authorized by the work of the aforementioned Sylvestre de Sacy. And here is a quote showing this connection. I had learned from Monsieur de Sacy and other authors, he wrote, that there existed in the Orient a plant resembling hemp, the effects of which were intoxicating. And I heard of the quite general use of this drug among Arabs. Monsieur de Sacy gave it the name hashish. I therefore sought it out, profoundly convinced that if this plant had intoxicating properties, it must have some medical power over the nervous system, end quote. Though Aubert Roche was correct in arguing that hashish intoxicates via a chemical stimulation of the nervous system, it was the mythical association between hashish and the fabled assassins, reified by the work of Sacy, that pushed Aubert Roche to seek out the drug and test its efficacy as medicine. After finding and using Dallemesque with some colleagues, Aubert Roche was further convinced that the resulting, quote, fantasia, bizarre ideas, canine hunger, and extravagant laughter, end quote, evidence this peculiar effect of hashish on the central nervous system. He further reported that Dallemesque does not cause headache, does not interfere with respiration, does not increase circulation, and leaves no fatigue after it, meaning it was a safer remedy, particularly safe compared to opium. Because he believed the plague and its signature lesions or buboles originated from the miasma's attack on the thoracic and cervic ganglia of the nervous system, Aubert Roche concluded that hashish, taken in the form of Dallemesque, dissolved in coffee, offered a safe, effective, and logical treatment to combat the disease. He reported that 7 of 11 people he treated were cured by hashish and strongly encouraged French physicians to adopt the treatment back at home. Alienist, psychologists called themselves in the 19th century, Jacques-Joseph Moreau de Tours, an organizer of the infamous Club de Hashichon in Paris during the 1840s, he likewise heralded Dallemesque as a homeopathic wonder drug, but for the treatment of mental illness. Moreau believed insanity, a physiological disease caused by lesions on the brain. And much like Aubert Roche, though he thought hashish intoxication excited the central nervous system to such a degree that it could both mimic and counteract the effects of these lesions. Moreau reported in his famous 1845 work on hashish and alienation that between 1840 and 1843, he cured 7 patients suffering mental illness at Bicêtre in Paris with hashish. Though physicians in France and abroad touted Dallemesque, again the edible form of hashish as medicine, as a miracle cure, they also routinely complained about the inability to standardize its doses due to the extreme variation in potencies of different cannabis plants and the common adulteration of Dallemesque exported from North Africa with other intoxicants, such as opium, datura, and Spanish fly as well. Earlier in the decade, several physicians and pharmacists in the British Empire attempted to solve the problem, make it more standard, the drug, by dissolving hashish in alcohol to produce a tincture. By the middle of the decade, French practitioners followed suit, developing and marketing their own hashish tinctures for the French market. The popularity of hashish tincture grew rapidly in France during the late 1840s, peaking in 1848 when pharmacists Joseph Bernard Gastanel and Edmond de Courtive engaged in a public battle over the patent, then known as the right to priority, for hashish tincture made through a peculiar distillation method. L'affaire Gastanel, as the press termed it, caused an uproar in French medical circles and occupied the pages of journals and popular newspapers in Paris for much of November and December of 1848. To defend his claim, Gastanel dispatched 2 colleagues from Cairo to argue his case. One, a physician called Villemin, claimed that Gastanel not only created the tincture method in question, but that his tincture provided a cure for cholera as well. Though Villemin was unable to convince the Academy of Medicine of Gastanel's right to priority, he did convince them to adopt hashish tincture as a treatment against cholera. Physicians in Paris didn't have to wait long to test Villemin's theory, as cholera quickly erupted in the city's outskirts only months later in December. But when hashish tincture failed to cure the nearly 7,000 Parisians that were killed by the Blue Death that year and into 1849, doctors increasingly lost faith in hashish tincture as a wonder drug, beginning its fall into disrepute. And in my book, and I don't have time to go into it here, the final chapter talks about how the real turn towards demonization and criminalization of hashish takes place in North Africa, particularly in Algeria in the 1850s, where again, much like during the Egyptian campaign, there was a general who passed a law against hashish. This happens again in the 1850s. So the imperial framing is also incredibly important for the story, something that I'm backgrounding to foreground the medical issues here today. So these earlier efforts to medicalize cannabis in France offer doctors, public health officials, and policymakers several important insights as they work to return cannabis-based medications to the French market. First, they urgently must work to dissociate cannabis intoxicants and medicines from the racialized and moral judgments about Muslims and Orientals in French space. Orientals with quotation marks using the term dominant in the 19th century. This association continues to this day. I talk about this in my book as well. There's disproportionate policing of Black and brown, particularly Muslim citizens in France that has to do with drugs. I've written about this in the conversation and Salon and Slate if you're interested as well. Number 2 lesson. Doctors and patients also must be measured in their expectations of the benefits of medicalized cannabis and careful not to promise the world and only deliver lackluster results. In the 1840s, they claimed that the drug was a wonder drug. It proved ineffective against the plague, proved ineffective against cholera. It proved ineffective against many of the major diseases that it was put up against, and this ultimately allowed it to decline in status as effective. And finally, we must remain aware that medical knowledge is historical, and we shouldn't go all in on a theory that is heavily contested or likely to be amended. So there needs to be a dose of measure. If history is going to tell us anything about the medicalization of cannabis, it needs to be done in a more gradual, rational, scientifically based way. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.